7th NEMIS Academy webinar. And I'm super excited to see all of you guys joining our webinar, and especially some new attendees are coming, and it's extremely inspiring for us. And we are just more and more motivated to bring more experts like Jeff Banks today. So first of all, before we start, I would love to do a very brief technical checkup. Just put in chat room plus if you hear me well, see me well, so we can go on. Just plus, and that's it. Okay, perfect. Great. Great. So our today's topic is very interesting. Actually, I was the one who could not wait to hear it, especially to host Dr. Jeff Banks in our live session, because this person is quite uncatchable. Today he's in England, yeah, and then after we'll travel to more other countries to visit more events and continue working in this crazy routine. And yeah, today's topic is about root cause analysis and recovery from microbiology incidents. And I'm happy to welcome Dr. Jeff Banks, our food quality and safety professional with more than 45 years of experience. And I just encourage you guys to be active during our live session and to type the questions if you have some, and I hope you will have a lot. Don't hesitate to type question in the chat room during the presentation so we can have a live conversation, because unfortunately our time is quite limited today, and we just want to cover as much as we can. So, Dr. Jeff Banks, are you ready?
Sure.
I give you microphone. Time is yours. Just tell me when should I share my screen.
Sure, please share the screen. That would be great. Good afternoon, everyone. Alina is going to control the slides, so that leaves me with one less thing to do. First of all, I'd like to thank NEMIS for the opportunity to talk to you. The original talk was scheduled in March, but unfortunately, due to how busy I was with incident management at the time, we had to postpone the talk to now. Anyway, what I hope to do in the next half an hour or so is to share with you some thoughts that I've got, which I've accumulated over many years, about root cause analysis, specifically focused on microbiology food safety incidents, and give you some of my personal and professional views about how these occur, what vulnerabilities there are, how well they're managed, and how perhaps we can do this better in the future. So next slide, please. So to give you something of a roadmap about what I intend to cover, first I'm going to talk about some definitions. You know, what's the difference between an incident and a crisis? Often these terms are used interchangeably, and in fact they're discreetly and importantly different. What we should all try to avoid are crises, but we should expect and plan and prepare for incidents, for sure. I'll also talk about why incidents occur, what's special about those incidents which are associated with microorganisms, particularly pathogens, why they occur. And I'll give you some of my own personal views about some of the golden rules in terms of incident management. Often I've seen incident management done very well, sometimes not done so well. And I think there are some golden rules about how to manage incidents, which I intend to share with you. I'll talk about three particular case studies in a little bit of detail. Salmonella in chocolate, Listeria in cooked meats, and E. coli in pizza. And maybe mention one or two other incidents that happened along the way, and hopefully give you enough time to ask questions at the end. So that's the roadmap. Next slide, please. But in case you're too busy today to listen to all of my talk, or you get bored, can we have the slide back up? I don't know if you can all see the slides at the moment. I certainly can't. Yep, I think the slide is gone, so I'll ask Alina to try to put up the presentation once again. I'll wait for her to do that. Just bear with us a moment.
Okay, now everything is visible. We are here. No one disappeared, right? We can continue.
Fine. Go ahead. Share the slide if you can. This is an example of how you should always expect the unexpected, I think. Yeah, so in case you can't stay to the end of the talk, these are some of my 4 takeaway comments that I would have from this presentation. First of all, what actually precipitates or what causes the incident, what triggers the incident? Often this has a profound impact on how effective that root cause analysis is. And this may not be immediately obvious to everybody, but this is my experience over many years, which is how that incident is called in the first place very much influences how effective the root cause analysis is done, and understanding that there's that influence is quite important. Number 2, especially in relation to microbiological investigations, we have to expect ambiguity. We have to expect that there will be errors. We have to deal with quite often poor quality, conflicting data, or even a lack of information. And this is extremely typical in root cause analysis, and particularly in the initial phases of that root cause analysis. And often the incident management teams that best cope with incidents are those that can manage ambiguity. And it's important when you think of your composition of your incident management team to recognize that those who can help most in those teams are those who can deal with ambiguity. The third comment I would make, and maybe as a consultant you would expect me to make this comment, is that quite often local internal technical resources are insufficient to actually cope with a particular root cause analysis. Often the information and the views are quite biased, and sometimes the team actually lacks the capabilities to actually run a proper, thorough, comprehensive root cause analysis. And the first point, often companies call me in and they say, wow, we didn't expect this. This is shocking. This is new. This was unexpected. No, truly, nothing is really new. And we often ignore or we miss the warning signs that lead up to particular contamination issues or incidents. And it's because those warning signs were not recognized or they were ignored that we actually have crises or incidents. Next slide, please. Some more definitions. Well, for crisis, as I said, these should be avoided at all costs. These are, by definition, unusual, they're unstable, complicated situations, and they absolutely can threaten businesses, brands, businesses, the actual existence of a food business. And there are some quite notable examples of where food businesses have gone out of business as a result of a microbiology crisis, recall, and outbreak. So those crises need to be avoided because they give rise in turn to rather uncontrolled reactions. And fundamentally, it exposes heroes from zeros. And there are many examples of companies that did not manage crises well. So, in contrast, an incident is a situation that could result in a crisis eventually, but typically where well managed can actually maybe only result in some business disruption or loss. However, it's the incident that really we should focus on. Next slide, please. And when I look back over my time in food safety, I think that considering risk, that zero risk really doesn't exist at all. There's almost always some residual risk if we look carefully within our businesses and our product portfolios. And whilst, I recognize this ambition for zero recalls, it's only hopeful and it's only really aspirational. So all food businesses must be prepared for incidents, and so they can avoid crises. And a word about pain. Business pain, felt at the high level of an organization or by individuals, it's felt not just during a crisis, but it's felt many days, weeks, months, and even years after a crisis. And the impact of food safety recalls and crises is felt very deeply. Next slide. Why do products get recalled? It could be for any one of a number of reasons. Typically these days, there is a link which is suggested between a food product or a food production plant with certain small number even of clinical cases in the population of illness. And that is becoming increasingly the way in which incidents are called. It might be as a result of consumer complaints, which of course should be managed and investigated properly, or it may be because the enforcer or the regulator demands that a company takes particular action. But increasingly, it's the food business itself that actually identifies and confirms that there is a potential threat to public health. And at this point, this obligation to report becomes extremely important. And all those involved in the quality function, food safety function in the business absolutely need to understand their responsibilities about when they must and where they have an obligation, a legal obligation to report. What is interesting is that this obligation to report, the regulation in various countries has strengthened significantly, and it's been strengthened because of some very well documented crises of outbreaks and food contamination in the recent past, in the last 10 to 15 years. And another point to make is that whilst you will read that most recalls are voluntary, it's almost always as a result of the regulator nudging the food business, putting pressure on the food business to actually initiate that recall on a voluntary basis. And there's one simple reason why the regulator often pushes a company to do it. It's because the regulator does not want possible litigation if it's proven in the future that the recall was not necessary. So often they're voluntary, but there's pressure typically from the regulator. Next slide, please. One of my reflections is that when I go in and help a company, often the immediate cause of the contamination has been or can be really quite quickly figured out and ascertained. And often that immediate cause and the subsequent corrective action is done, but typically it's only a temporary fix. And my experience tells me that if the root cause is not properly established, very typically a recurrence or an escalation is the result. And this is where it's so sad, because we can learn from other companies' mistakes and from warning signs within our own companies. And we could, in fact, anticipate and I think prevent outbreaks and recalls and crises. The fact that there are so many examples of when that doesn't happen shows us that our root cause investigations often are not well done, not comprehensive, not proper. And 3 examples might be those at the bottom of the slide. A salmonella incident that happened in chocolate not so long ago, which initially was blamed on contaminated ingredient, the cocoa liquor, the cocoa mass, whereas the environmental contamination in the factory was blissfully ignored or considered to be unimportant. That was incorrect. Another example would be the listeria incident in cooked meat, which I'll talk about in much more detail in a moment, which was initially blamed on poor hygiene, but fundamentally it was a problem of poor hygienic design of a particular piece of equipment and its operation. And last, E. coli in pizza, which caused really quite a serious outbreak in France recently. Initially, the communications expert from the business blamed it on consumers not cooking the pizza. I mean, how crazy is that to communicate that at the start of an incident? Next slide, please. This is a cartoon of chicken licking. And chicken licking, of course, was very anxious and panicked. And Chicken Licken, when faced with a dilemma, a problem, an incident, panicked and said the sky is falling. And this is one of the golden rules of incident management. Don't panic. And it's really important that the first phase of any incident management is to check the veracity, the accuracy of the claim, allegation, or the data. Very often mistakes are made right in the initial phase. The claim is believed, the allegation is thought to be proven, the data are trusted, and this can set off incident management in the wrong direction. And so in the very early phases, it's very important to check the veracity of the claim or the data. Secondly, keep an open mind. The best incident management teams are extremely open. They encourage argument and debate. They accept conflicting views and opinions, and it's very important to do that. Inform and involve legal advice. If you have legal representatives within a company or outside, do involve them and do inform them. Very important indeed. If only for one reason, which is that people involved in legal work often are extremely disciplined and structured and encourage and force incident management teams to take good notes and produce evidence. The activation of the incident management process is important. And whilst most businesses have these in place, a common failure is for the team to go what's called off-piste, to use a skiing analogy, which is they deviate from the incident management plan and the process that they themselves wrote, which is a mistake, and it can be a disaster, and it requires good discipline. Also key is communication. And this is both internal communication and external communication to media, to the regulator, and to the enforcer. And it's really important in incident management to at least attempt to own the narrative and to not be surprised, to anticipate and plan for and not be constantly surprised as you go through the process of managing a particular incident. Next slide, please. A note about communication. Speak the truth. If a business or an individual doesn't know something, they should say so. They should not make it up or try to wing it. And it's important never to leave this communication vacuum, because we see, and there are many examples of where misinformation fills that vacuum with speculation and noise, which only distracts the business from what they're doing, which should be to manage and solve the incident or the crisis. And leaders in businesses need to be sincere, concerned, and credible. Food safety is based on trust between the food manufacturer and the consumer. And communicate what you're doing and promise to update and keep to your promises. And my personal opinion is it's important to escalate internally quite fast, because you can always de-escalate in a controlled fashion. Why is it that we have so many recalls on a Friday afternoon all around the world? I'll tell you why. It's because in food businesses at a local level, there was not fast enough internal escalation, discussion, decisions made early in the week. No, people prevaricate. People don't want to admit that there's a problem, and they hide things. And it's only towards the end of the week they realize they don't want to be sitting on this problem over the whole of the weekend and blamed for an untimely reaction. And so what happens is it's escalated towards the end of the week. The business has to make a decision, and sometimes that is to inform the authorities. And that's why we have a lot of recalls at the very end of the week. Communication errors often are made early in an incident. They're easy to make. We all make mistakes, but they're really hard to resolve. Next slide, please. So what's special about microbiology incidents? Well, I've thought long and hard about this. And I think in contrast to where you've got a chemical contaminant, which can be quantified, in microbiology, it's seldom binary. And the facts are often uncertain. And this is in the very nature of biology, of variation. Therefore, ambiguity is high. The information, the results we get from the laboratory, they can change during the actual investigation of an incident. Time is the enemy, but microorganisms need to take time to divide, to become detectable, to express certain characteristics, to be identified and characterized. And time is the enemy, and everybody wants answers during an incident or a crisis. And the other thing I've learned about microbiology is that even faced with data from laboratories, eventually it comes down to a risk assessment. And risk assessment is done by experts, and therefore judgment is exercised. So you better make sure you've got the right experts who have expertise and experience, because quite often final decisions are based on judgment. And another and last point about microbiology laboratories is that they're like miniature factories. They rely on the human factor. They rely on people. They rely on skill. They are not immune from error, from mistakes. And we should always question in a professional way whether the laboratory is certain about their data, whether there could have been cross-contamination or a miscommunication. And so trust the data, but always question and be sure of the quality of that data. Next slide, please. The process is important to follow, and one of the most important things to do is to establish a timeline. Often people look back retrospectively and create a really nice timeline for the events leading up to a particular microbiological contamination. That's great. But I think in incident management, one needs to go further. It's not just to establish the retrospective timeline, there should be a prospective timeline as well. And what I mean by that is that all of the tests that you're calling for, the extra tests and the environmental tests or product tests, these ought to be anticipated as to when the data from those experiments, those tests, will come into the incident management team. So being prospective in a time matrix is incredibly important, so you know when to call your meetings, what decisions you are likely to make based on the data that you receive. And I think in microbiology, more than in any other incident, the word presumptive really needs to be well understood within a business. Presumptive does not mean confirmed. Presumptive means we think it might be a problem. And all too often now, businesses get a rush of blood to the head and they react to presumptive data. And this means that the decisions are not necessarily well made, or they're made on incomplete data. And the last point, I think, in terms of root cause analysis is that in very large and very complex root cause analysis involving multiple sites or countries or markets, it's very important to divide up the work and assign responsibility to different tracks of work for people to actually report back to that incident management team. Last but not least, in microbiology, always consider the uncertainty that you may have in your data. Next slide. I don't really want to say too much in this slide. Clearly, a crisis can demonstrate how powerful and how well run an organization is. Unfortunately, in relation to food crises, often it exposes problems, lack of capability in top management and leadership teams, and after a very serious crisis, the organization itself really doesn't come out unscathed. It comes out differently. And I think there are several recent examples of where poorly managed crises have resulted in this particular problem. Next slide, please. As I said at the start, crises impact on people, businesses, and brands. And if we even take a recent salmonella in chocolate crisis that happened, even the CEOs are not immune from the fallout and from the investigations and the postmortems that happen after particular events. So how businesses respond in incidents and with crises very much, I think, tells you that there are winners and there are losers. And all too often there are losers in relation to crises. So crises, again, we should avoid at all costs. Next slide, please. So coming on to talk about some specific examples. One example I want to give you is salmonella in chocolate. And this happened a few years ago. And ironically, it was that the business was doing so well that the pull from the market required the production site to run all of its 13 manufacturing lines at the same time. Normally, 12 lines would be in operation, and one line would be inspected, maintained, cleaned, and sanitized. But the pull from the market was so huge that the maintenance and the cleaning was neglected, and all of the parallel lines were running at full capacity. This really was the last straw that broke the camel's back, because at that same production site, environmental salmonellas had been found, in fact, for 7 years, every year leading up to that particular outbreak and that recall in 2006. The immediate cause was quickly established. There was some cleaning water inside the factory that dripped from a drain into the dry ingredient of the chocolate. And when that was fixed, the business thought that they'd solved the problem, that they'd done the root cause. Of course, this was not the root cause at all. The question should have been, well, why was that water in the factory contaminated with salmonella? The fact is that that water was coming from a river. The water was extracted from the river and used without treatment in the factory. And what was also notable between 1999 and 2006 was it was always the exact same strain of salmonella that appeared in the environment and even in the chocolate. And the DNA signature gave clues about its origin. And I'll come on to that in a moment. Next slide, please. The lesson in that was to really understand the microbiology of the production environment, not to ignore warning signs, not to consider that environmental positives for salmonella in a chocolate factory were acceptable, they're not, and to investigate, get to root cause. At that time in that company, it was believed that because salmonella didn't grow in the chocolate, it wasn't important. This, of course, is fundamentally wrong. And this is why it's very important as a lesson to verify internally held procedures and views with external experts. An outside view is extremely valuable. Next slide, please. So, turning to Listeria, the world's deadliest outbreak, which occurred in 2017-2018, really brought to mind what Churchill said, which is those who fail to learn from history are condemned to repeat it. This was an avoidable outbreak, avoidable contamination. The fact that so many people were sickened and so many deaths occurred was quite shocking, very awful, and also very sad that 40% of those deaths were babies who were actually born with listeriosis, day 0, and they were dead within a week. And a shocking outbreak, and I helped in the root cause investigation of that, and it was attributed to a hypervirulent strain of sequence type 6. Next slide, please. It was believed that it was poor hygiene, but as Darwin told us, you know, if we admit a first cause, the mind still craves to know whence it came and how it arose. In modern speak, that means, you know, you should be curious. You should not go for the easy connection. You should look very deeply into why it was that the outside casings of this particular polony, why were the outside casings always contaminated with a particular strain of Listeria monocytogenes? Be curious. What actually happened in that particular contamination was that the chiller, the brine chiller that you see here on the left of the slide, this brine chiller was used to chill down, to refrigerate the sausages which had been pasteurized. And inside that brine chiller, there were some hygienic design faults, as you see in the middle slide. These allowed for Listeria to persist in that equipment and to grow in that brine at low temperature to extremely high levels. And as those sausages passed through that brine chilling step, so they became contaminated with Listeria monocytogenes. Some got into the polony itself, others were on the outside, but it caused this massive outbreak. Next slide, please. The lesson here was, you know, poor risk assessment for sure. You know, a lack of consideration of many previous outbreaks involving very similar types of meat. A lack of reaction to environmental positives. the L mono was found in the environment on equipment, but there was no good reaction to that. Failings in cleaning and sanitation, equipment design, and then more fundamentally at a business level, lack of transparency, poor crisis management, a very slow recovery in that particular business. And not only that factory was eventually shut, but the entire meat division was disposed of. Huge financial costs, reputation costs and damage, and the resignation of the CEO. Next slide, please. Others will remember in Europe we had an outbreak involving 12 deaths, coincidentally also associated with Listeria monocytogenes sequence type 6, but a different strain from the South African one. But it happened almost immediately after the outbreak in South Africa. And by chance, in France, some routine testing of frozen peas and corn produced a match on the database with this strain, which was causing a disease in several European countries. And the testing showed that there was a very low level of Listeria monocytogenes of a particular type in frozen peas and corn. Quite quickly, one factory in Hungary was identified as the source, and this factory was part of a group structure, and it supplied 12 other factories across Europe. When the recall was done in August 2018, there was an extremely comprehensive root cause analysis done, remedial work and corrective and preventative actions. And amazingly, that plant started again under special measures on the 13th of September in the same year. Eventually, this was a good recovery for the business. Next slide, please. And I think it speaks to how the vulnerabilities were identified and how the initial root cause, which was wrong, which blamed underblanching of the sweet corn, how with a professional investigation you really could get to the root cause and the sources of vulnerability in that particular product. What we found was that drainage and conveyance belts were contaminated, but particularly the individually quick frozen, the IQF freezer, was re-inoculating the product with a particular strain of Listeria monocytogenes, which was deep-seated and persistent in the freezer itself. The company reacted well to this and de-risked its other plants, learning from the vulnerabilities in the Hungary plant. And today, the plant in Hungary, in my opinion, operates best-in-class quality, with producing excellent quality and in-specification products. So recovery after incidents absolutely is possible. Next slide, please. E. coli in pizza. Really quite a shocking outbreak and a shocking situation. Happened in France. This was a ready-to-cook product, frozen, resulting very sadly in the death of 2 children, but equally sadly, another 10 children who will never be able to live a normal life, who will require kidney dialysis or kidney transplants at some time in the future. Quite shocking. The authorities questioned the hygiene in the plant, questioned the occurrence of E. coli in the flour that was used to make the pizza dough. But I think there probably will be additional questions about the product design and the cooking instructions for the consumer. Was the cooking validation sufficient? For sure, there was very poor crisis communication at the time, a lack of transparency, and really there was no recovery for this particular part of the business. Next slide, please. This Nestlé Buitoni pizza outbreak recall was a lesson in how not to manage a crisis. It really required the company to look at its critical ingredients. It required the company to look at and react to environmental positives, to maintain a clean and hygienic plant, to do proper cooking validations. Others will decide and judge whether, in fact, the company did that or not, because this is still sub judice. What I thought was particularly sad about this was that Nestlé had an almost identical problem in the United States 13 years prior, involving the same organism, E. coli, in cooking dough. And in effect, what Nestlé did was simply repeated history. So sad and so avoidable. Next slide, please. The question I often ask people in the food business is, does anybody remember Snowbrand? And the answer that comes back, who? Snowbrand? Who are they? And the reason why nobody remembers Snowbrand anymore is they had one hygiene problem in a factory in Osaka, in a CIP line. Staphylococcus aureus was allowed to grow. It produced toxin. It impacted thousands of people in the milk powder. But the company failed to respond to the environmental positives. It covered up the failures, and the root cause investigation, really was unworthy of a food business. In that particular case, the reason why nobody remembers Snowbrand is that the confidence in the business collapsed. Not just the Osaka factory, but other factories closed. Massive costs to the business, and the business was eventually taken over. So that's why nobody remembers Snowbrand. Next slide, please. So I'll just summarize by saying that in my experience, often the first idea in a root cause analysis is often wrong, and that's okay. But it's important that the team recognizes that often the first idea of what went wrong is actually wrong itself, and persists in having an open mind, recognizes that bias can exist within local and within a business team, and that allows the incident management coordinator to really have the authority to direct resources and to make decisions. It's ever so important. So, as we learn from Nestle, those who fail to learn the lessons of history are forever condemned to repeat them. At that point, I'll stop. And next slide, I will ask you if you have particular questions.
Thank you, Jeff, for such very informative speech for me. It was really very interesting to listen. I bet that for our attendees as well. And I see that we have already some questions here. So if you don't mind, I will start already reading it because we are quite tight with the time. So the first question from Thorsten Hecht: what is known about the yeast extract issue?
Right. Well, I'll try to, thank you very much for the question, Thorsten. I believe you're probably referring to an incident that happened some years ago, which affected the snack food industry, companies that were making salty and savory snacks. And that, it was a salmonella issue, if it's the one I think you're talking about, involving a serotype called Salmonella Manchester. And the company involved at that time was called Quest International, which is part of the Unilever Group. And what had happened there was that the yeast, which was a byproduct of the fermentation industry, the wet yeast was roller dried, but during the roller drying process, the yeast extract was recontaminated with environmental Salmonella Manchester from the environment around where the product was being dried. That yeast extract, or autolyzed yeast extract, was then used as a carrier for herbs and spices that was used all over the snacking industry at the time. The Salmonella, it was shown later, the Salmonella Manchester actually came from rats, from rodents, which were living in the canal, which was adjacent to the particular factory. So a number of risks involving, pest control, access to the factory, contamination of the environment of a factory, mistakes made in terms of thinking that roller drying was a particularly effective and lethal part of the process, and of course fundamentally in a failure to protect the processed, the dried product. As we know, salmonella doesn't grow in a autolyzed yeast powder. However, it doesn't die. And I think with a lot of low moisture food products, sometimes we have to remind ourselves that in fact, even though a pathogen does not grow in a particular ingredient or product, does not mean to say it's not still a problem.
Thank you very much for answer, Jeff. The next question was from Thin. Is Nestle the story you once shared on LinkedIn?
I think it probably is. I mean, look, Nestle is the world's biggest food company, and you could say statistically they're going to have proportionately more issues to manage, more incidents to manage, and crises to avoid than maybe any other company. The way I look at it is this: I'm a food safety professional. And I think that if you are in the food business and you consider yourself a leader in the food business, maybe by virtue of your size and your scale and so on, if you consider yourself to be a leader, you should act like a leader. And that means in taking all reasonable precautions in design quality, make quality, and deliver quality and food safety. Food safety is non-negotiable in my mind. If the food isn't safe, it should never be put into the market. And therefore, as leaders, big food companies actually have a particular responsibility, which is to lead and show the way, to show what good is, so that others can be influenced and persuaded and can follow them. With Nestle, I think, they obviously need to reflect on the fact that there does appear to be some repetition or making a mistake again and again. And, in my view, in large companies, sometimes the corporate memory is rather short, unfortunately.
Thank you, Jeff. The next question comes from Martin. Do you recommend any specific root cause analysis methodology for food safety incidents? Why and fishborne, etc.?
Yes, the 5 why approach, extremely good. The fishbone analysis, absolutely. When I actually go in and help companies doing investigations, or even in assessing their vulnerabilities, I use a technique which really is somewhat similar to a fishbone analysis. I actually think that there are 6 key risk elements in microbiological food safety. The first is the environment of the plant. The second is the equipment. The third is cleaning and sanitation. The fourth is the process, the layout. The fifth is measurement and testing. And the sixth is people and practices. So when I think about a fishbone, I think about it in terms of risk elements. And it's important to openly, honestly assess in each of those risk elements where the risk is highest in a particular manufacturing site. And to actually then try to progressively de-risk that particular factory or that process according to how critical the vulnerability is in one or other of those 6 risk elements. But specific root cause methodology, very important. It's part of the incident management team process. Getting to root cause is incredibly important. People can use a number of different techniques. The 5 whys absolutely is a great thing to use, the fishbone and other analyses too. And it's important that the team actually looks laterally, thinks laterally and more broadly rather than simply focusing on what they're dealing with locally. They need to pull in and integrate anecdotal information, factual information, information from experts to help them put into context their particular local situation.
Okay, thank you. Next question is from Julian. How important is, in your opinion, a proper environmental monitoring program for pathogens to avoid and solve such a crisis?
Well, thank you, Julian. I could have focused more on this, but to me, end product testing, it's a safety net, positive release. It's a safety net with very big holes. It really statistically is meaningless in terms of modern food manufacturing and the volumes that are produced. The environmental monitoring program is incredibly important. Typically what I see with companies who have problems is they either had a very weak environmental monitoring program for pathogens, or they didn't react to the warning signs that were being given from results from that environmental monitoring program. So I know it costs money, and it does cost real money to take swabs and to take analyses from factories on a regular basis, but it's so important. When I go back and I look at companies' records and databases during the course of an investigation, I look back over weeks and months and years. If there's been a strong environmental monitoring program, you can actually see the warning signs. You can see the small issues that happen in particular parts of the plant, in particular parts of the process. And with the right mind, you can start to link these together and form a hypothesis about where a pathogen may well be persisting, and also how it's being vectored and moved around in that particular factory. So having a strong environmental monitoring program is incredibly important. I encourage everybody to look as much as they possibly can, as frequently as they can, not just after they've cleaned and sanitized, but at the start and during, at the end of production, because all of these pieces of information are incredibly important, not just to resolve and understand an issue, but to predict and to prevent crises.
Yeah, actually, this topic was another webinar, so I hope Jeff will have time for giving this to us. So next question comes from Torsten, again related to the previous one. Yeast, is spray drying safer than roller drying, or same risk? Correct.
Yeah, correct. Okay, so Torsten, obviously you're very keen on this this subject. We should talk about it offline, perhaps. Look, I don't think it's a case of saying that spray drying is inherently less risky or safer than roller drying or other types of drying. In fact, I think that one needs to recognize that in whether it's spray drying, roller drying, secondary fluidized bed drying, they all have some inherent weaknesses, and those need to be recognized and managed. Crack testing, absolutely. Crack testing is an incredibly important part of safeguarding equipment, hygienic standards and performance over the course of time. Absolutely support that view. But no, I wouldn't fundamentally say that you can say that spray drying is safer than roller drying. It depends on the hygienic design and maintenance and condition of specific pieces of equipment.
Thank you, Jeff. The next question, sorry, I will push a bit because we have not so much time, from Anna. Have you ever come across pathogens in tofu products?
Yes. Yes is a short answer. I would say that yes, I've come across Salmonella, E. coli, Bacillus cereus, for example, associated with tofu. And therefore, once again, not zero risk. The process needs to be managed properly with excellent hygiene and so on. Yes, you know, people are surprised. We suddenly find pathogens causing recalls and outbreaks and clinical cases from unusual vehicles, unusual foods. I don't think we should be surprised. Microorganisms, you know, are much smarter than we are. They adapt and they evolve to exploit, you know, the niches that we create for them in how we handle ingredients, how we manufacture food products. And so, yes, we should not be surprised if we find pathogens in maybe unusual ingredients or food products. And yeah, thank you for the nice presentation. Oh, that's the important one. Thank you.
Yeah, and Torsten today, one of the most active and curious visitors. So does it make sense to make typization of environmental Enterobacteriaceae in spices they occur naturally?
Okay, so the few things there. First of all, what has revolutionized, I think, incident management and what has revolutionized food safety in the last 10, 15 years has been the ability of the health authorities to subtype pathogens. In other words, not just to identify a particular pathogen, the Salmonella or Listeria monocytogenes or E. coli, but to actually subtype it and genetically characterize that particular pathogen. And the same is true for other microorganisms. inherent in this idea of understanding the microbiology in your own factory and in your products, it's really important to not just understand the types of pathogens that you might have there, whether you've got a persistent type or a transient type that comes in with an ingredient and goes out, and also to understand the other microorganisms, as he refers to them as environmental Enterobacteriaceae. It's important to understand what you've got. And in relation to the particular question about spices, yes, of course, in spices, you can get Enterobacteriaceae really at quite high levels because of the nature of the ingredients, how they're grown and harvested, how they're stored. And that's why, of course, establishing standards, numerical standards for Enterobacteriaceae in dried spices is really quite difficult to do. However, we do need to recognize that some of those Enterobacteriaceae in spices and herbs could well be E. coli or Salmonella and therefore be of public health significance.
Great, thank you. Next question comes from Rita. Only BAM methods should be used in microbial analysis of food, or any lab-developed method can be used to minimize the time of analysis?
Okay, so I think the question here, and thank you for the question, relates to the US BAM methodology, which is really the standard method that's used in the USA for food analysis. More broadly around the world, it might be, you could rephrase this as, should only ISO methods, international standard methods, reference methods be used? My view is that other methods are perfectly acceptable so long as they are broadly equivalent to those BAM or ISO methods. I think that food businesses have a responsibility to use whatever methods have value and utility, and sometimes those are not going to be standard reference methods because of, let's say, the very short shelf life of those products. If you applied an ISO or a BAM method, you would have shipped the product 3 or 4 days before you got the result. So clearly there's a disconnect between only using standard reference methods in environmental analysis or end product testing. So I would say whatever method works, and so long as it can be broadly equivalent to international standard methods.
Thank you, Jeff. Next question from Gilberto. How to engage other departments more focused on costs and efficiency? How to maximize quality culture?
Yeah, well, there wasn't really time to talk about quality culture today, but it's incredibly important. The leadership in any organization pretty much defines how people behave. People copy the leader. People emulate the people above them in a structural hierarchy. So if the leader does not exhibit a care and a consideration and prioritize food safety and quality, you can't expect anybody else in the business to do it either. The first time a top leader or senior management individual walks past the hand basin and doesn't wash their hands, you pretty much have lost the trust and the buy-in of everybody in that factory. So it's incredibly important to engage all functions in relation to quality. And when I ask the question of businesses, who's responsible for quality, sometimes you get the really dumb answer, which is, the quality function's responsible for quality. No, I don't think so. Everybody is responsible for quality, and there's quality and excellence that should be demanded in every function. That's from procurement to operations to supply chain to even in sales and marketing, as well as in quality. So everybody is responsible, and actually engaging other departments to show them how they are an integral part of maintaining quality products, right first time, exceeding customer expectations, minimizing risk to the business. Engaging other functions is incredibly important if we are to establish a true, strong quality and food safety culture. So best of luck, Gilberto. There are obviously a number of ways in which one can do that really quite powerfully within a company.
Yeah, thank you, Jeff. Let's try to cover last 2 questions within the next 5 minutes. Are there any guidance documents you can recommend for determining appropriate limits for environmental monitoring results?
Yes, that's coming from Charlotte. Thank you, Charlotte.
Sure.
There are. Sometimes these are not easily accessible or well known. They can be really quite specific, and correctly so. They're quite specific to the particular type of technology used to make a food product. So, you know, wet from dry, depending on the technology being used. So the guidance documents really are quite segment specific, and they're specific to the technology and the process that's been given. What I would suggest is maybe offline, we can follow up on that particular one, and I can suggest some particular guidance documents depending on the specific food process that's being used there.
Thank you, Jeff. Last question from Lalita. Your recommendation for indicator organism which can be used in validation for different pathogens?
Yeah, well, I'm a strong believer in looking for warning signs and indicators of potential issues. And undoubtedly, in some situations, you know, for example, Enterobacteriaceae are a really very good hygiene indicator, which might suggest the possible presence of E. coli and or Salmonella, or even Enterobacter or Chronobacter sakazaki. So there are certain indicators which have been proven over many years to be really important to monitor and even to quantify in particular parts of the environment, because they can give an early warning that the conditions there may well be appropriate also for a pathogen. However, I would just say that with indicator organisms, you have to be careful not just to look for the indicators. You also should look directly for the pathogen as well, because one without the other is really not the basis of a comprehensive environmental monitoring program.
Thank you very much, Jeff, and thank you everyone for such actively interactive session. And I encourage you to share your questions if you have more, and I'm pretty sure you have more, to our info@nemistech.academy. So, and thank you all. We had really cool session today, and I invite you for our next session which will be on 23rd of April with Bill Marler. So I'm pretty sure it will be also a very cool session for you to ask questions and to learn something new and exciting. Thank you, Jeff. Thank you, everyone. You will get recordings with the follow-up email, and then after it will be published to our LinkedIn profile as well as to YouTube. Have a nice day, everyone, and bye.